Hello and welcome to the tutorial for the Sheep and Beef Greenhouse Accounting Framework tool, also known as the SB-GAF. The aim of this tutorial is to provide you with a little bit more information about the GAF tools, as well as learn how to fill in the SB-GAF tool with your own data and interpret the results. Watch this video at your own pace, and if you need, please take a break. We understand that filling in large Excel spreadsheets can be incredibly intimidating, but the aim of this tutorial is to try and make it as simple as possible. To fill in the GAF tool, you'll need to know input data such as fertilizer use and fuel use, as well as animal numbers and weights, and sales and purchase data. If you don't have access to the exact data at the moment, feel free to use an estimation or an approximate value, and you can always go back and fill in the correct values later. The tutorial today is using version 2.3, but because these tools are constantly updated, there's a good chance you may be working with a newer version of the framework. This will mean that your tool will look slightly different, and the outcome of the GAF will also be slightly different, but you should still be able to follow along for most of the tutorial. Part 1. Introducing the Greenhouse Accounting Framework tools. For those not familiar with the framework tools, they are Excel spreadsheets developed by the Primary Industries Climate Challenges Centre, and they reliably estimate greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural enterprises using the least amount of information possible. The tools achieve this by using emission factors from the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory, as well as peer-reviewed literature. All sources are cited within the tool for transparency and are updated whenever there's a change in international or national policy. The tools are free to download and can be accessed from your computer on the Primary Industries website. Part 2. How to access the Greenhouse Accounting Framework tools. To access the tools, all you have to do is go to pic.org.au/resources/tools. Or if you're already on the Primary Industries website, just go to Resources and then Tools, and it'll take you to the page that has all of the greenhouse accounting frameworks. If you do have multiple different enterprises on your farm, you will have to do multiple different GAFs to be able to get the total greenhouse gas emissions produced. But today we're just going to do the SB-GAF. And if you go across to the right, the number at the end tells you which version it is. Just click on the hyperlink and it'll download an Excel spreadsheet for you. I also recommend downloading the Meat and Livestock Australia Accounting Manual, as well as the Guidelines for Conducting a Carbon Audit. Both are great resources to have. Understanding the layout of the Sheep and Beef Greenhouse Accounting Framework. When you open your GAF tool, you'll see lots of tabs at the bottom of the Excel spreadsheet. Those tabs are mostly just the background equations for the GAF tool, and you don't need to worry about them. We just leave them there for transparency. The only tabs you need to know about are the Introduction tab, Data Summary, and the Data Input tabs for beef, sheep, and vegetation that are relevant to your enterprise. Starting off with the Introduction tab, it has information about the scope of the framework, in particular that it doesn't do a carbon footprint of products because it doesn't consider emissions between the farm gate and the consumer, just emissions on the farm gate and before the farm gate. And also, because it is designed to be nationally accurate, not specifically accurate, there's a chance that emissions could be off by about 20%. The Introduction tab also contains all of the references for the Greenhouse Accounting Framework tool. So if you do have a question about how we got a certain outcome, you can go to the relevant tab, go across to the right, and you'll be able to see the exact equation and where we got it from if you would like to understand a little bit more about how the GAF works, but that's completely optional. The Data Summary tab shows the emissions from your enterprise and divides them into Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions that we'll go into detail about a little bit more later. It also shows the sequestration from vegetation and the net farm emissions, which is the total emissions plus the sequestration to reduce your total emissions. It then divides the emissions produced by the total volume of products sold to create the emissions intensity for sheep, meat, wool, and beef, including and excluding sequestration. The GAF also shows which greenhouse gas emissions are being produced and divides them into nitrous oxide, methane, and carbon dioxide, as well as providing a hotspot analysis, which shows the largest sources of emissions in your enterprise. Now we're going to fill in the data input tabs, starting with the beef. The beef and sheep tabs are very similar. At the top, there'll be a box asking you to put in your location, as well as asking about rainfall. Then for both, you need to put in livestock numbers and weights, and live weight gains. If you don't know how to calculate those, we'll go through it in a second. There's a form that you can use. Crude protein and dry matter digestibility are pre-filled based on state and territory values. If you know your crude protein and dry matter digestibility, feel free to change it, but if not, please just use the assumed values. Underneath, you need to put in the number and weights of purchase and sale stock. And then underneath, you need to put in the percentage of cows calving for each season. This is because cows that produce milk consume more feed and produce more greenhouse gas emissions when they produce milk. Underneath, there's boxes to put in supplementation, fertilizer, fuel, feed, and herbicides and pesticides, and we'll go through all of them and the unit that they require. Below is the Savannah burning section. If this isn't applicable for you, feel free to skip it. On the data input sheet page, the only things that are really different is, as well as having to put in the sales for livestock, you also need to put in the sales for wool by including the kilograms of greasy wool produced and the clean wool yield. As well as having to put in the number of ewes producing milk, you also need to put in the percentage of lambs, and we'll go through how to do both of those as well. Similarly to the beef, the crude protein and dry matter digestibility are already pre-filled, and all of the other inputs below are also the same. The only difference is that there's no Savannah burning for the inputs for sheep. The last data input page is for vegetation, and this is for carbon sequestration. So this data requires location, state, and region, as well as tree species, soil type, area of trees planted, and the age of the trees to determine how much carbon was sequestered. Because different trees and different areas sequester different amounts of carbon, if you do have different plantings, you can put in up to 4 different options to get the different rates of sequestration. Part 4, how to fill in the SB-GAF. Now's the time to grab your data, and I'm going to go through the data input tab for beef, sheep, and vegetation, and go through every single box to tell you what data needs to be in there, and we can fill it in at the same time. This is a hypothetical sheep and beef enterprise in Victoria that I've put in some fictitious values for, just as an example of what your GAF will look like at the end. Don't pay too much attention to the actual values, they're just there to serve as an example. Starting off, I'm going to input the beef data. At the very, very top, it's going to ask you for your farm name. As well as putting in your farm name, it's also really helpful to put in the year that you're doing this audit for. I've put in the 2020 to 2021 financial year. You can also put in a calendar year if you prefer, as well as the date that I'm completing this audit, so I don't forget when I did this. Next, select your state or territory, and then we're going to go across the spreadsheet and select whether or not you're above or below the Tropic of Capricorn. This hypothetical farm is below the Tropic of Capricorn, but it is in a high rainfall area. So I am going to say it receives more than 600 millimeters of rainfall a year. If you do have any questions about why we ask this data, and there's a little red arrow, you can go across and it'll give you a little bit more information about what we're asking for and often why we're asking for it and how it helps us select the right emission factors for your farm to give you the most accurate results. Now we're going to go across to the livestock inventory. This is one of the most important aspects of the GAF because greenhouse gas emissions on farms are largely just a function of animal numbers. And here you can see that I've actually gone ahead and changed the dates. Instead of seasons, I've changed it to the months of those seasons instead. This is better for me to comprehend, but it might also be better for you if you're somewhere that doesn't have 4 seasons. Feel free to change it. Just make sure that you're replacing the seasons with the same months. You couldn't, for example, make the top tab June, July, August. It has to stay September, October, November for the emission factors to give you the right calculation. Next, when calculating livestock numbers, these are the seasonal averages of the number of livestock on the farm. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there are 100 bulls on the farm in spring. And what I mean by this, I'm going to go through this example. So in autumn, it says that we had 75 bulls on the farm. What this actually is referring to is there was 100 bulls on the farm for half of that season, 50 were sold, and then there was 50 bulls on the farm for the other half of that season. That means the average for that season was 75, even though there were never 75 bulls on the farm. There was only either 100 or 50. You need to calculate the seasonal averages for all animal classes for all 4 seasons before we can progress. Take some time to do this now, and then we'll go through live weight and live weight gain. To calculate live weight from live weight gain or live weight gain from live weight, hit the little question mark button and it'll take you to a sample tab. Here, all you need to do is put in your data to this little grey box, and the equations below will calculate the live weight gain from live weight or the live weight from live weight gain. Sample 1 shows the live weight gain from live weight for beef, as well as for sheep. And if you scroll down, there's the formula to calculate the live weight from live weight gain for both beef and sheep. To do this, you need to know either live weight or live weight gain. Once you've filled in your values, you'll need to copy and paste them and bring them back over to the Data Input tab. Here I've cheated and I've just taken the equation from the sample tab and put it into the live weight gain to calculate the live weight gain directly in the Data Input tab. Underneath, I've just used the dietary values for Victoria. And for the purchase inventory, I've just put in the number of head purchased, as well as the sales weight and where I purchased them from. With the sales inventory, you want to make sure that any sales you make, you're also taking away from the livestock inventory. So the 50 bulls that I sold in autumn, you can see them there in the sales inventory, and I've made sure to remove them from the inventory as well. This is important because the total sales made, the total live weight of sales made is what's going to be used to determine your emissions intensity. So you want to take the time to make sure that you're accounting for all your sales. Next, it's going to ask you for what percentage of cows are calving and at what season. For this scenario, I've just said in winter, 70% of all cows had calves. And to keep it simple, I've just said that all of the calves born were born in winter. Next, it's going to go into inputs. These are broken up by enterprise. And so to keep things simple, I've just divided it as about 10 to 20% inputs for the cattle operation and about 80% for sheep. First off, for mineral supplementation, it asks you what percentage of the product is urea, and then it asks how many tons of product you purchased. In this scenario, I've said I purchased 10 tons of product for the cattle enterprise, and 30% of that product was urea. Next, for fertilizers, this asks you for tons of urea in the product. So if you purchased 1,000 tons and it was 10% urea, then you put in 100. Similarly, for the nitrogen fertilizer, it asks for tons of N, not tons of product purchased. And then go across and select the nitrogen fertilizer that most closely resembles what you used. Here I'm going to say DAP. And then below, put in the limestone, as well as the fraction of the limestone that is calcium carbonate versus dolomite. Once again, to keep it simple, I just said it was 100% calcium carbonate. Underneath, it's going to ask about fuel and food. as well as putting in the litres of fuel and petrol a year. It also asks for electricity. Ignore the state grid and percentage option. If it's renewable, it's not going in the GAF anyway. So to keep things simple, we're just going to put in the electricity that was used from the grid for the cattle enterprise. Next, put in the grain, cottonseed, and hay purchased in tonnes. And the last input that you need to put in is herbicides. They're broken down into herbicides that produce a lot of greenhouse gas emissions and all other herbicides and pesticides. And when you put this in, it asks for the kilos of active ingredient, not kilos purchased. Finally, there's a savanna burning section at the bottom that you can fill in if it's applicable for your enterprise. But if it's not, just leave it blank. It's not going to affect your results at all. Next, we're going to go to the data input for sheep. As you can see, I've already put in the farm name, selected the area, and I have said, yes, this is a high rainfall area. The livestock inventory is calculated the exact same way. We have our seasonal averages for the livestock numbers, and we've calculated live weight gain from live weight and put it into the columns there. Below, all of the feed data is taken directly from the Victorian values once again. The only difference for the purchase inventory is that instead of asking you where you purchased it from, is it asks what percentage of sheep are merino and what percentage of sheep are crossbred. I'm going to say that all of the sheep purchased were merino. And then for sales inventory, as well as putting in live weight sold, you need to put in the wool sold. You do this by saying what number were shorn, as well as the kilo of greasy wool shorn. And then you need to add the percentage of clean wool yield below. And this will give you the total tons of clean wool produced a year. And once again, this is what's divided by your emissions to create your emissions intensity. Underneath, there's a carbon content for wool. We've put it at an assumed value of 45.2. If you know your carbon content, you can absolutely change it, but it shouldn't be too different. Next, as well as putting in the proportion of lambs of used lambing, which, to keep it simple, I've said 50% of all ewes were lambing in winter and 50% in spring to create a total of 100. Next, we need to put in the seasonal lambing rates. Because half of the lambs were born in spring and half were born in winter, and the total lambing rates were 120%. I've just put 60% for winter and 60% for spring to give us that 120% total. And then underneath, we have all of the inputs. This you fill in the exact same way as you filled in the cattle, just making sure that you use the right proportion. So while we used about 10 to 20% of all resources for cattle, it's about 80 to 90% for sheep. And as you can see, it's much higher here as well. Once you've filled in all your inputs, head over to the data input tab for vegetation. As you can see here, this enterprise had a couple of different species. And so I've done 3 different boxes for their vegetation. I'll select the state, the region, the species. The first one was a radiata pine. And we're going to say it's about 100 hectares that is 5 years old. And once again, we're going to do the allocation slightly more favorable to sheep and smaller for beef. The next one we'll say is mixed species, 250 hectares at about 3 years old. And then the last one is a mixed species planting that was planted as some shelter belts, so about 25 hectares across the farm, and they're only 1 year old. Now this means if we go back to our data summary tab, hopefully this gives you some idea about where these numbers came from, and it gives you a bit more context. Part 5, understanding your SB-GAF results. Congratulations, you've made it. Hopefully you should have a data summary page that looks something like this with all the columns filled in and some colorful graphs. If we zoom in, you can see how the data is broken down into beef, sheep, and total on-farm emissions. This is so you can see which enterprise is responsible for which emissions and make it really clear where your sources of emissions are coming from. If you go over to the left, you'll be able to see that there's a couple of rows that have the same resource in them. So for example, fuel's in there a couple of times for scope 1. And if you scroll down, it's also in scope 3. Don't worry, we haven't double counted it. Scope 3 is the emissions pre-farm, so the emissions to generate and sell you the fuel, and the scope 1 is from using the fuel. And you can also see on the left, it has which greenhouse gas emission it is. And if you go over to the greenhouse gas breakdown, it shows you what percentage and what volume of emissions are nitrous oxide, methane, and carbon dioxide, although all of them have been converted to tons of carbon dioxide equivalents to create one standard emission. What's interesting here is the enteric methane, which is in row 8. If we go across to the hotspot analysis, we can see that it's 64% of total emissions, including scope 3. This is actually incredibly low for enteric methane because this isn't a real scenario. You'd expect it to be closer to 80% in a real life scenario, so don't worry if your number's higher. In total, 8,710 tonnes of scope 1 emissions and 21 tonnes of scope 2 emissions were produced by this enterprise. When doing a carbon audit, scope 1 and scope 2 emissions are the emissions that a farm is responsible for. Scope 1 are produced on farm and within the farm gate, and scope 2 is produced elsewhere from electricity, but because it still involves decision making from the farm about how much electricity to use, the farm is still responsible for them. Below we have scope 3, things like fertilizer and herbicides. These the farm is not responsible for, but it's important to include them for a couple of reasons, especially about decision making and about how you decide which inputs to purchase, especially in the future as low emission options become available. Here you'll be able to see that the largest source of emissions was purchased livestock. This is because when you purchase livestock, you inherit the emissions the emissions from the day that it was born until the day it was sold to you, unless those emissions have been accounted for. So here, 10% of emissions were from livestock, but if they had been purchased from someone who had already inset emissions or offset emissions, and they were 0 or low emission, you'd be able to remove or reduce that number. Underneath, it shows the carbon sequestration, net emissions, and emissions intensity. So starting off with carbon sequestration, this is the value from the data input vegetation tab, and that's how many tons of carbon dioxide equivalents the trees that I entered into that tab sequestered in that year. The carbon sequestration is then added, because it's a negative number, to scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 totals to create the net farm emissions. The net farm emissions is then used to calculate the emissions intensity. So here you can see the emissions intensity for sheep, meat, wool, and beef, including and excluding sequestration. For example, sheep meat produced 8.4 kilos of carbon dioxide equivalents for each kilo of live weight. Without sequestration and including sequestration, that dropped down to 8 kilos of carbon dioxide equivalents per kilo of live weight. These emission intensity values are not what you would expect because this is a fictitious data set. If you go to the MLA manual that I referenced earlier, you'll be able to go to table 2, and that has the emission intensity values for Australia, and you'll be able to see where you sit compared to the national range. When you calculate the emissions intensity, it's also important to note that this does include scope 3 because it's saying how many emissions were produced to create this kilo of product, whether that be live weight or greasy wool. So that's one of the reasons why we include scope 3. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. We hope that you found it helpful. If you do have any questions, please drop them below and we'll try and answer them. This is an incredibly difficult thing to do, and we understand that it's very overwhelming and we want to be as helpful as we can. That being said, MLA does have an online version of this tool that is more user-friendly. You don't need to be a levy payer to use it. You just need to make an account. And we recommend giving that a go. Otherwise, if you're not comfortable doing a greenhouse gas audit at this stage, don't worry. The most important thing is knowing what data you need to do an audit and making sure you're keeping that data every single year so that you can do an audit at any time. Thank you again.